Armchair Critics Podcast.
Armchair Critics Podcast.
Members of the notorious Armchair Critics Podcast have been arrested for having too many opinions.
Armchair Critics Podcast!
All right, everybody, welcome to episode 7 of Armchair Critics Podcast. I'm your host, Ethan Engert.
And I'm your host, Aidan Howe.
And today we are covering Denis Villeneuve's English debut, Prisoners. This is one of my favorite films from one of my favorite directors. I was very excited to rewatch this. And Aidan, I am psyched to hear what you have to say about this film. So let's just jump right into it. Tell me what you think.
All right. Prisoners, the first thing that stuck out to me was just how impressive it is. Like, a lot of the films on this list, you know, it's just sort of this conjunction of fantastic directing and fantastic acting. The cinematography.
Yes, sir.
Oh, man. Roger Deakins, my guy. He's the only cinematographer to ever be knighted, and he deserves it, particularly for movies like this. It is stunning. You can feel it. This movie makes very impressive use of sort of a locale that's not particularly interesting at first glance. I mean, if you're an American from the Northeast, like me and like you know, you see places like the locations in this movie every day when you're driving to work, you know? But Roger Deakins is able to give them this vibrancy that keeps you just sort of awestruck the entire time as you're watching.
You're absolutely correct.
That was just insane. Villeneuve is very skillful with the directing. He makes good use of the score. The score didn't blow me away necessarily like I hoped it was, because I really, really like Johan Johansson's other scores that I've heard. I believe he did Arrival and Sicario, and both of those are absolutely fantastic soundtracks. And then the final aspect was the acting. Hugh Jackman is terrific. Paul Dano is terrific. Jake Gyllenhaal, as always, is terrific. And just, yeah, you know, I think it's a great flick. I do have a few issues with the narrative.
Whoa.
So I'll kind of dangle those over you.
Wow.
But we'll get into that later. Ethan, first off, I want to hear your opening thoughts on this movie.
All right. I have written down, everything about Prisoners is designed for maximum impact. Villeneuve prioritizes tone and atmosphere in his direction, but that doesn't mean Guzikowski's script isn't at center stage. While it's the direction that draws the sensual pleasures and visceral torment from such a script, it's the script itself, whose twists and turns I'll gladly get lost in, that compels me to wander through this maze of a film, a maze which extends to the themes I found myself pondering for subsequent days. This film has a lot to chew on, and it's a mouthful. I really do mean it when I said that. After I watched this film, the entire rest of the day and the next day, I was pontificating. I was looking desperately for other people's thoughts on what it all means. There's a lot of layers, and it's a little difficult sometimes to untangle what is intentional and what is, you know, kind of the Kubrick effect of someone overanalyzing the film, myself included. But this, even on rewatch, is just so fun and so terrible. I've talked about this before. No other film has ever affected me like Prisoners. The toughest thing for me to handle in a film is children in peril, which is what this film is about.
Yeah.
And the second toughest is snakes, which is also in this film. So it's just a brutal watch, but it's the most fun brutal watch. And I commend all the talent. You talk about Roger Deakins. He's my favorite DP of all time. Denis Villeneuve here, I love. Maybe my third favorite director. It's, you know, important to note those two working together because I love the Coen brothers, and Deakins works with those two as well. And maybe it's just because I'm so partial to the Coen brothers and I love them so much and all the decisions they make. And I might say that Deakins and Coen brothers is the best team, but Deakins and Villeneuve also might be the best team. But yeah, all around, this is impressive. But not without flaws, I must say.
I gotta agree. Your point about it being like both brutal and awesome, I totally felt that while I was watching this. Like, I was like absolutely on the edge of my seat for the first act, and then just during the second act where like not as much is happening, I'm just sitting there like, I don't want this movie to end. You know,
Yeah.
I want this to go on for hours. I'm enjoying this.
Yeah.
So let's dive into the narrative.
I want to hear what you're talking about.
Okay.
What are your nitpicks here?
Well, first off, obviously, spoiler discussion. Go watch Prisoners if you haven't.
Yes, sir.
As always, it's a good movie.
Fantastic.
I did not like the twist villain, and I think that the third act especially was too focused on having just twists and gotcha moments at the expense of the mystery making very much sense. Most of all, I feel that the villain was simply too campy and collided with the bleak and serious tone that the film did a very good job of achieving up till that point, if that makes sense. I mean, in a sense, although she is well developed in some ways, the villain feels like a collection of gimmicks. Like you've got the snake lady and the maze lady, and she was formerly religious and wants to punish God or something, so she kills children and she puts them in holes, and she's got old cars. She's just like, she just feels like 4 Batman villains in a trench coat. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just, I don't know. In another movie, I feel like the villain could have totally worked, and in Prisoners, I feel like it absolutely would have worked if the tone wasn't so serious most of the way through, but it just came across as jarring, in my opinion. And the film also achieves such a good sense of moral ambiguity throughout. Every character is relatively morally ambiguous, especially Keller, I believe that's his name, Hugh Jackman's dad character, you know, is such a well-developed character that just having him face off against sort of a standard cartoon villain at the end doesn't really feel like a satisfying payoff.
Okay.
I did like the very ending of him like you know, blowing the whistle and stuff, and Detective Loki just noticing it. I thought that was cool. And the first 2/3 of the film especially were just amazing narratively. Beautifully written, like realistic, but also involving dialogue that like draws you in, you know?
Yeah, yeah.
And the first scene, as I said, had me on the absolute edge of my seat. Yeah. Like, children being kidnapped is such an inherently horrible thing that I couldn't look away, you know? And Villeneuve almost expects us to go in knowing what the film is about.
Right.
And he does all these little teases throughout the first scene. So, like, you know, a character will walk in and say, you know, where's Anna? And I'm like, oh, man, this is it. And then, nope, they find her. That happens a couple times throughout the first scene before the girls actually go missing. Mm-hmm. So he's just, like, slowly poking you and prodding you like I don't know, like an insect with a pencil until you get into this absolute state of panic, and then, bam, he actually hits you with the event.
Yeah, that's good. Wow, those thoughts on the third act. I can't say I can agree completely, but I can't say I don't see where you're coming from. I think the villain is simultaneously one of the strongest and one of the weakest aspects of the film. And I'm genuinely shocked to hear you say that you're not impressed with that twist ending. One of my notes I actually wrote down was how integral it is kind of to the plot. And maybe, you know, this is my rewatching so I can see. But this film cannot exist in this state without the twist existing the way that it does. It's kind of convoluted, but Alex's aunt, or abductor, being the abductor of all the children, is pretty integral, I felt, to a lot of the twists. And I was impressed with the way that it's proven, and, you know, I wasn't like, ooh, wow, I don't know, that felt slapped on at the end. However, I do agree. Her motivation is kind of weak.
Yeah.
I found myself justifying it because it's good, it's fine. But this film is not fine. Everybody else, you brought up the moral ambiguity. Every other character goes through some sort of, like, you know, they have redemptive and damning qualities to them all. And she just doesn't. She's just terrible, and she's literally fighting God, which is, like, ridiculous. Like, I don't even know what that means. You don't believe he exists, so you're fighting him? So you're trying to make other people not believe in God by abducting children? That's kind of wacky. And you are correct that there are some pieces. The snakes seem kind of unnecessary. Again, I hate snakes, so maybe I'm biased, but they did not need to be in this movie. That was maybe just like one too many things, but it's still like these are all my criticisms that I have of this film. I can find a rebuttal for, because while the snakes are like maybe a little superfluous, it does tie it all together, and you wouldn't have that terrible scene where they go to the one-child predator's house, or Detective Loki does, and there's all those boxes, and you see that, and you tie that to the fact that they're digging up dead snakes at the end of the film, and it's this thing that ties it all together.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty good microcosm for all of my criticisms of this film. They are not misses, maybe shortcomings. That's how I'd put it.
Gotcha.
But you were talking about earlier this dread that is built up in Act 1, and I absolutely agree. This is shot like a horror film. I can think of multiple specific shots off the top of my head that seem like POV monster surveillance shots of like some evil demon in the woods looking in through the windows of the house, and you don't quite know what's stalking the people yet. Mm-hmm. You get shots from within the RV that Alex is driving around. You hear his breathing.
That was terrifying.
It's horrific. But another thing that I would add is those shots show a lot of restraint, which is something I would like to talk about later on in this podcast.
Gotcha. Interesting points. And yeah, your whole point about rebuttals is interesting, because as I'm sitting here thinking about the problems I have with film, I am realizing that there are answers to each of them. I don't know that they're necessarily very satisfying answers.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
I was thinking about how maybe sort of the central theme of the film, or one of the central themes, is grief, and how people just sort of deal with adversity and with horror and tragedy.
Yeah.
And there's sort of a connection there between Keller and the villain. What's her name? I know she's Alex's aunt. She has a first name, assumably. It's like Helen or something.
Let us see. Holly Jones.
Holly Jones. Okay. So there is sort of a connection between Keller and Holly, because they're both parents who have lost their children and who sort of do evil acts and criminal acts in response to that.
Mm-hmm.
And, that is sort of an interesting connecting thread between the protagonist, I don't know if I'd call him a hero, and the villain. But Keller's actions make a lot more sense.
You're right.
Because he's not really purely just taking out his frustration on Alex. He legitimately believes that Alex has his daughters, and he is trying to figure out where they are. And once he fully accepts that Alex does not know where his daughters are, he stops. Holly is just doing it out of, blind rage. And it just, I don't know. I just don't buy it that this like sweet seeming old lady who's very polite to everyone, like her kid dies and she immediately decides, okay, I'm going to be a serial child murderer for 30 years now.
Yeah, I have no counterpoint to that.
I don't know. It's a little frustrating. Yeah. I will agree, the snakes are simultaneously superfluous, and they do kind of add to the movie. They create that sense of horror, and that one scene where he is opening the boxes is just as bewildering and disorienting and just generally freakish as it should be.
Yeah.
You've got a whole bunch of different levels of anxiety there. You've got, children's clothes in boxes covered in blood, which is horrifying.
Yeah.
And then, all the snakes are escaping. Detective Loki, who's normally very calm and collected, is freaking out. And you just have no idea what's happened to the kids. You have no idea if he's finding them or not, if this is Villeneuve's way of telling you the kids have been found. You don't know.
Yeah.
That's a great scene.
Yeah.
And that's another example of the movie being able to create an absolutely fantastic sense of panic when it wants to. Even in the scenes where I didn't really like how the plot was developing, I never got fully disconnected. I never had a moment where I sat back and went, this sucks.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not involved anymore. Even in the scenes I didn't like, I was involved. The scene where Holly has Keller at gunpoint is a gripping and extremely watchable scene, even though I didn't think the twist made much sense.
Yeah. Yeah. You were talking about that scene with the boxes, and the first time I ever saw that was the most gut-wrenching moment I've ever had while watching a film. And it shows, exactly, Guzikowski is able to get into your head, and he knows what you're going to think. If you see a room full of boxes with holes punched in a known child predator's house, immediately your thought is, I hope Jake Gyllenhaal doesn't open those boxes to find dead children. And in this film, that is an absolute possibility.
Mm-hmm.
With an hour left, that could have happened.
Oh, yeah.
Because there's enough happening. And the subsequent scene is when Detective Loki brings the two families in to ID the clothing. And it seems like this confirmation that the children are dead. And I remember the first time, I'm just like, I don't know if I can believe that, but I don't see any way they can't be, And then he's just like, yeah, it was all pig's blood. And you're like, oh my gosh, there were a million ways this could have ended fine,
Mm-hmm.
But it's just like, in the moment, the script and the direction just play with you in the exact way that these guys wanted to. I remember forever when I was describing this film to people, this is one of the most, probably, for me personally, behind Shutter Island, this is the most, I don't know what word I would use. This is the film that toys with my mind the most and is able to divert my expectations the best.
A film that manipulates you in a way.
Yeah, manipulates. You see at the beginning of the film, the script tells me it has to be Alex, but the direction tells me it can't be. And later on, you're saying, the script is telling me it can't be, but now the direction is telling me it has to be. And there's like these constant, like, because of my, preconceptions of cinema and just narrative art.
Yeah.
There are these moments where I say, it has to be Alex. It can't be Alex. It has to be. It can't be. And it just got to a point where I say, I give up. Just take me. I'll watch. I'll try not to think about it. And then I find myself thinking about it again, and I get played again. It's absolutely masterful, and I just loved it.
That's the sign of a good film, is that it can... You don't feel detached. It wants to create a certain mindset, and it succeeds, and it draws you along with it, rather than you simply remaining detached.
Yeah.
And that's Villeneuve's power. That's the power of a good director. Yeah, and that was probably my favorite aspect of the film. It was just, how gripping it was. I couldn't turn away. I couldn't stop watching. Let's talk about the characters.
Yes, please.
Detective Loki is, hands down, one of the coolest protagonists in cinema I have ever seen. And I know they would never consent to it, but I would absolutely not mind an entire movie series about this guy. And I would watch every single film in it, no matter how good they were. He is just magnetic, and he's such a refreshing contrast to film detectives that we've seen beforehand, because he's not an old man in a trench coat, and he, remaining fairly detached, it seems, from the events of the film, particularly at first. I mean, even when he's interviewing the families of children who have been kidnapped, he doesn't even bother really trying to comfort them. He just kind of sits there while they cry it out and then continues to ask them questions. He almost seems disinterested. Yeah. But you can see him sort of slowly lose his mind and become more and more involved and upset as the movie progresses. Mm-hmm. Which is, Gyllenhaal at his best there. Yeah. It's just amazing to watch that happen. And, obviously not nearly as defined as the film's other protagonist, Keller. He definitely has character flaws, which are explored throughout the film. I'd say number one is his pride. Yeah. It starts out by Killer's wife going, "Is it true that you've solved every case you've been given?" And in kind of the first emotional response we see from him, he kind of like smirks and he nods and goes, mm-hmm.
Right.
And that's sort of what drives him throughout the film is that drive to never lose a case, I'd say. Although he personally becomes more emotionally involved in it as well.
Yeah, Jake Gyllenhaal is one of my guys, and I underrated his performance the first time through, and that doesn't mean I didn't like it. I liked it, but the second time through, I was like, oh my gosh, it's even better this time. He is so fun to watch.
Mm-hmm.
More so than many of his films. You know, Nightcrawler, he gets a more fun character to observe, but this is equally as entertaining just because of this, level of performance.
You can just see him like exploring the character and giving him all these little idiosyncrasies.
Yeah.
Apparently, like the tattoos and the haircut were his idea.
Really?
He proposed them to Villeneuve, and they added them in. Yeah.
That's crazy. I saw plenty of videos that went super deep into all of the symbolism of this film, and the tattoos are pretty integral to many of those videos. So that's pretty awesome to hear that was his idea. I believe the characters are one of the most complex and dense pieces of this film to tackle in a fun way that is kind of impressive. This is a film that, in retrospect, it feels like a 2.5-hour film because there was a lot that goes down. There's a lot of this experience that happens after the fact.
Yeah.
Some of that is comparing how these characters all interact with each other, or rather what they all represent. You hit on a good point earlier that this is a film that one of the themes is dealing with grief. And it's super cool to see all these individual characters do that differently. I compared that to The Thing.
Oh.
I watched that recently. One of my favorite films, top 20 probably. In that film, it seems like John Carpenter asks the question, what if, before he does anything. What if they come across the Thing mid-transformation? What if these two characters have this rivalry? What if this character has, this personality trait? And, while very comparable to Alien, it sticks out and is its own separate thing because it touches on so much. And Prisoners, I feel, did the same thing, where every single character is incredibly unique. More so than in 90% of all movies ever made. 90% of all good movies ever made.
Yeah.
And it's super cool that Keller is this character who I can understand. I've met people like him. All of his detective work is circumstantial. He puts out this thing, this idea, after Detective Loki tells him it couldn't be Alex. He has the IQ of a 10-year-old. His entire rebuttal is, well, if he has the IQ of a 10-year-old, how could he drive a car?
Yeah.
It's okay, good point, but what are you arguing right now? That doesn't... Okay, case closed, he must have kidnapped the girls. You see this character deal with his grief in a very similar way, where he feels like he has all the answers, whereas his wife is, kind of smothered by all of this grief and gives up and just kind of drugs herself into a stupor, while other characters are, because of this experience, more sympathetic, while another one is just apathetic to all life in general. It's very interesting to see, and in the end, it drives the two character arcs, Loki's and Keller's, and it's so cool that this emotional reaction that the viewer is feeling is kind of the vehicle for the entire plot. You see, because of Keller's grief, he falls into this, he descends down this spiral of just bad decision after bad decision, getting worse and worse, but he can justify it all. And that is duetted by the fact that He is a Christian, and he often is found reciting the Lord's Prayer.
Oh, man.
Not obviously something that he invented. But in the end, when all hope is lost, when he's put in a situation in which he can do nothing, he says, okay, God, I give up. I'm going to give it to you. And for the first time, I think, in the entire film, he says a prayer that he came up with. And then after that, we cut to Detective Loki showing up to the house. Likewise, Loki is affected by this grief for children he doesn't even know. And he begins the film very apathetic and has the opposite arc where he becomes more empathetic and a more alive person.
Yeah, until by the end, in that one amazing scene where he's driving to the hospital, he is like crying out. He is terrified that Anna will die. This girl who he's never even met before.
Right.
He is horrified by the thought of her death, and he's fighting through this like cloud of pain in order to get her to the hospital.
Yeah.
Just a perfect ending to his character arc.
Yeah, and it just makes, his introduction makes that height all the more rich. To see a character who was so, steely at the beginning, be so emotional, that is, for me, the most emotional scene in the film. The first time I watched it, I walked out. I've told you that. I couldn't finish that scene.
Mm-hmm.
And it is massively because of that character arc.
Just gorgeous. Yeah. Your points about Keller are also very, very good. He's probably the most three-dimensional character in the film, I'd say. Mm-hmm. Probably even more so than Loki. And probably maybe the most powerful moment in the film, for me at least, was a pretty brief one. And that's where he's sitting on the bathroom floor after torturing Alex for a while. And he starts reciting the Lord's Prayer. And then he gets to the line, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who have trespassed against us." And he can't get it out.
Yeah.
Because he realizes the hypocrisy of saying that when there is literally a man trapped next to him who he has tortured for 3 days, and he just breaks down crying.
Who may have trespassed against him.
Yes. And it's this just absolutely perfect portrayal of a man who is so desperate and miserable and grief-stricken, and he just wants his daughter back, Yeah. Initially in the film, I was annoyed with him. I was like, all right, bro, I understand. You lost your daughter. That's horrible. I feel for you. But, torturing this guy is completely unreasonable. But as time went on, and as he became more and more well-developed as a character, I started to wonder, what would my reaction be in this situation?
Yeah.
I don't know that I'd end up any different from him.
Yeah.
And he became more and more intensely sympathetic. All of this, of course, is fueled by Hugh Jackman's incredible performance, which is, I'd say, very nearly or as good as Jake Gyllenhaal's. He gives the perfect intensity in the climactic scenes. The scene where he and Terrence Howard's character are torturing Alex, and he's got the hammer.
Yeah.
Just absolutely terrifying. And he's got this great physicality to it, and he can express more intimidation and more vulnerability in the same performance than many other actors can in either, often in the same scene. The scene that sticks out to me the most performance-wise, which is just these two great actors playing off each other, is where Keller notices Loki tailing him.
Yep.
And he goes, after going to the liquor store, he comes out and he gets in the car with him. And they start having a conversation. Loki's kind of probing him, he's trying to figure out, where are you going? And Keller just becomes more and more defensive and more upset. And he ends up screaming in Loki's face before just kind of wandering home slowly and drinking himself into a stupor. Just desperate.
Yeah.
Just such great dynamics in that scene with each character trying to accomplish multiple things at the same time. That is one of the best written and best acted scenes, I'd say.
I absolutely agree. And I agree with your point that Keller is the most developed, most three-dimensional character as well. I'm thinking of your point on his performance as being very antagonistic and vulnerable at the same time. And it's so impressive to see, his character and his internal struggle come through. I was thinking of that exact scene before you mentioned it. He sits in the car with Loki, and he is shouting and slamming his fists against the car, and you just understand what he's thinking, what he's trying to put out, and what he's really feeling. He is acting aggressive because he is so defenseless. It's so interesting that his character is, he has this fallout shelter in his basement.
Yeah.
He's supposed to be prepared for anything, and in the blink of an eye, he couldn't stop his daughters being taken, and it ruins him. And it's just so interesting to see that concept fully developed. It makes me think of Villeneuve's and Guzikowski's work overall with this film to create, I mentioned in my synopsis, tone and atmosphere. They are integral to this film. And especially in Act 1, it's not an exposition dump. It's not distracting characterization as the plot is progressing.
There's not a whole lot that you need to understand initially. It's fairly simplistic. It's not like, you don't need 45 minutes of Prisoner's lore dump in order to understand this story set in a small town surrounding a carpenter and a police detective.
Yeah. It was impressive to me to see how much you learned from the beginning. I forgot how much you learned. Like, it feels like not much is being said, and that's because I would say it's not. It's being shown. You see these characters interact, and, with one line that Hugh Jackman flippantly gives, you learn, about their economic situation, how he feels about that, how he deals with it, what kind of dad he is because of it.
Yep.
And it's just like, there's so much packed into that scene that you just know, you just get it. That's kind of the same way with all of the exposition here. And I would take that further to say that this is not a cerebral film. No, that's not true. Simultaneously, this is a very cerebral film and a very emotional film.
Yeah.
Thematically, there's a lot to chew on, like I said. But the narrative, which is pretty much the core, it just happens, and you feel it out, and you just kind of synthesize it rather than analyze it.
It feels very organic. You're not sitting there going, okay, rising action, falling action, climax. It just flows naturally.
You're absolutely correct. Organic is a word I used myself. And that is shown through a lot of the cinematography, which you were talking about, blows me away. At first, I wrote, I don't think I've seen a film I've ever felt so present in.
Yes.
Just last week we did The Master, which I said, because of the positioning of the camera, you felt like you were a spectator of the scene, and it helped kind of draw you in.
Mm-hmm.
But this does not do that. You just and some of it is sound design, but it's mostly visual. The way that it's like, I know what temperature it is right now. I know what time of day it is right now just by a single shot. You feel that kind of stuff.
Despite the cinematography being gorgeous and drawing the beauty out of everyday areas, it almost never feels flashy.
Yeah.
It's sort of like, it's a little more stylized than movies like The Big Lebowski overall, but it is sort of similar to what Deakins does with the Coens.
Yeah.
Where he mainly uses it to fulfill a sense of presence, and it's really funny to compare these two movies because they have such different tones. But in both The Big Lebowski and Prisoners, The only scenes where the cinematography really gets flashy are scenes where the characters are in a bizarre headspace. In The Big Lebowski, it's where the dude is dreaming and he's having the dream about bowling with Maude.
Right.
You know? And in Prisoners, it's the scene where Loki is driving to the hospital and he's freaking out and he's close to fainting from his head wound. And there you just get these beautiful, just abstract, art housey shots of, like, you know, the city lights blurring into the background until the car becomes a vessel in a river of light. And even though you feel this panic along with the character, all you can do is sit there and just wonder at the beauty of it. It's amazingly effective, and it's what makes Deakins so great is he understands exactly what each moment needs, not just in terms of content, but in terms of flashiness for the cinematography.
Yeah, those are really good points. And, you know, I said earlier I want to talk about the flashiness, the lack thereof, how well Deakins and Villeneuve are able to subtract and simplify. And that scene is a great example. It's a very simple thing to do. It's just, you know, adjusting the focus to be very, very shallow. But you understand what it means. If even not cerebrally, you are seeing this very fuzzy image and you think, okay, you know, Jake Gyllenhaal is literally slipping into unconsciousness. But it's also this kind of like, you know, what is going to happen? You know, the line is blurred. It could go either way. The girl could die in the back of his car. But it just, above all else, puts you in this emotional headspace of just delusion. And, you know, you feel disoriented and everything's fuzzy, you know. And I've not really seen a film that just puts you into the perfect emotional situations, especially for me, who that does not often work on. I was exactly where these guys wanted me to be all throughout the film, even on a second watch.
Yeah.
To speak again to that mutedness, that's kind of something that prevails throughout the whole film. The score you mentioned, I actually liked a lot, partially because it's not obtrusive. It is pretty laid back, but it's just like these big, like a boom when something bad happens, or this rising orchestra as stress begins to, like, you know, grip your heart. That's a great way to describe, you know, every aspect of this film. The cinematography is not flashy, but it gets you in that headspace. The music gets you in that headspace. All of it creates this great atmospheric and emotional comprehension of this world.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I also like the score. It did not blow me away in the way that I expected, but your point about it fitting the tone of the movie and being relatively subdued most of the time is a great one. And I think it's used very well in tandem with, as you said, sound design. You know, in some climactic scenes, you've got music. In other scenes, just as climactic, there's nothing. You can just hear, you know, the gentle rustling of leaves and the crunching of footsteps, and it really draws you in.
Yeah.
So this movie, I would say, is not maximalist. It knows exactly when to pull back, and that's a common theme throughout the filmmaking.
In such an impressive way.
Uh-huh.
I was talking earlier about the presence I felt in this film, and I couldn't put my finger on just why. But later on, actually, I believe it was the scene in which Loki he's just going to Holly Jones's house to let her know that her son has been found, but he comes suspicious and is actually he ends up saving the day. But he hears a noise inside the house, and he tries the handle, and miraculously it is unlocked. But he begins to move through the house, and it's this, you know that we're building to the climax right now. And it's this lull in which the camera is just moving through the house, sometimes forgetting Loki completely. And it was eye-opening to me in that moment, maybe subjectively, the most gorgeous cinematography throughout the film. And I finally understood what it was that I was noticing. It's the fact that Villeneuve loves shooting spaces. Just the way that he could show the house, it felt very present. And later on, there are some forest shots or just shots with trees, and the way that the camera is positioned, it feels like you're amidst it all. And never, ever in this film did I not have absolute perfect knowledge of the spaces that we were in. It was like I had a map in front of me, and it was because Villeneuve just, had this great vision of exactly what it should look like, and he just hands the reins over to Deakins and says, "Make it look beautiful."
Yes. That's a fantastic point, and as I'm thinking through the movies I've seen, I'm realizing more and more that's a common theme throughout his work. Oddly enough, when you said spaces, the number one film that popped into my mind was Dune, which is very different from Prisoners in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
But it has these gigantic sort of brutalist spaces and locations throughout the film, which the camera just explores perfectly to give you that massive sense of scale, but also to let you know where everything is. And it's interesting to see how Villeneuve has basically ramped up from shooting houses extremely well to shooting, gigantic spaceship hangars extremely well.
Yeah. I found this really interesting, quick, short interview with Villeneuve where he was talking about he had done some very low-budget French-Canadian films prior to this, and Incendie being the best of them, but still, obviously kind of indie. But he was saying that with this film, it was so fun, and he said it was the first time he felt like he was with people who were having fun and enjoying making a film without this monetary constraint or just this pressure to not have gone into debt for nothing. And it's crazy to hear Denis Villeneuve, who directed Blade Runner 2049 and Dune, say that with, massive budgets. They look like they have massive budgets, but it's so cool to see from his very first opportunity, Villeneuve making the most of what he's got. And I know you loved Dune, and I was captivated by it as well. And I saw this other interview with Villeneuve talking about just making that film for him. That's such a great creator mindset where he just says, I want to have the most fun. I want to make the best film I can. And he thrives in that situation.
He legitimately loves making movies, and that's what makes him great.
Yeah.
That he and his friend that he grew up with in Northern Canada started drawing storyboards for a Dune movie when they were both 13 and they read the book.
Wow.
That's who you want making your movie, man.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's just, a little aside. But yeah, you can feel that everybody is focused on this movie. Nobody in this film, and, I can't obviously see and pick out the work of every individual crew member, but with the cast members at least, every single person here is focused on their work.
Yeah.
And even the side characters are giving the best performances that they can.
And they're good actors as well.
Terrence Howard, he's more of a pro actor than most of the bit characters, but, he's still a relatively minor character overall in the storyline. He gives an excellent performance, which I did not expect, because the only other thing I'd seen him in was Iron Man 1, where he's kind of a meathead. But he's really good for this character. Same for the actress who played his wife. Unfortunately, I can't remember her name at this moment, but she was very good. Just everybody here is at the top of their game, and they're having fun. I saw some set photos from this movie, which were pretty funny, because they were Jake Gyllenhaal and Paul Dano hanging out talking, and Paul Dano's entire face was covered in, the bruising makeup in the scene where they pull the bag off his head, and he's just, all swollen and bloody. And he's just chilling out, talking to Jake Gyllenhaal in between takes in this makeup. Everybody's at the top of their game.
Yeah. Speaking of that scene, holy crap.
Oh, man.
I remember seeing that for the first time. And even the second time, it's horrific. And I think that's, again, something that Villeneuve, throughout his filmography, has excelled at. I think of 2 films later, he does Sicario with one of the best cold opens to any film ever. With
That scene is incredible.
Yeah. It's amazingly shot. He's got Deakins again. It looks gorgeous. But he is able to, and I know for a fact, aside from this film, after this, Villeneuve loved working with the scriptwriters. He always had a story credit, even if he wasn't the number one. But, in that scene, he holds back as long as possible and builds dread for as long as possible. People are seeing something, and it's horrific, and you just can't wait any longer. And you finally see that, during this SWAT raid, they blow a shotgun pellets into the wall, and they find dead bodies, and it becomes a whole different scene. And the same thing, he does this multiple times throughout the film, but in that one scene in the bathroom, you're waiting. He draws it out as long as possible. You're waiting to see, all right, he's got a bag over his face for a reason. Slowly walk over, wait to pull it off. She finally pulls it off, and then you cut to a shot outside the room where the sink is obscuring his face. And I remember watching it the first time and be like, oh my gosh, what's this dramatic build-up? Just give it to me. And I was still like, oh, okay, all right, yeah, that was way more than I was still expecting. And that's the kind of weight that he brings to this whole film. A lot of build-up for, I said it, maximum impact. There are devastating blows to your psyche throughout this film. And all the way up, like the build-up is horrifying, and then the reveal is horrific. And it's just so fun to be in such a thrilling thriller. It's refreshing.
It's like, again, it's like in the cold open of the film, Villeneuve is almost playing with you.
Yeah.
He's enjoying getting maximum impact out of all of these little reveals and just little moments throughout the movie.
Yeah.
I want to talk real quick about the scene in which Loki visits the priest's house.
Okay.
Because that scene, I thought, was many of the film's greatest strengths, just all displayed in one scene, if that makes sense.
I'm glad to hear you say that. I was a little worried when you started that, but yeah, I agree.
I like that scene. There's great use of spaces. There's 3 different rooms that it takes place in. 4 if you count being outside. There's the living room where the priest is on the floor. Then there's the kitchen. Then there's the basement. And you have 100% understanding of where he is at all times. Mm-hmm. It's insanely intense. We don't really have much context for the scene. We're a little uneasy when he comes in and finds the priest's passed out on the floor. We start to get really worried when he notices that the fridge has been moved and pulls it aside. And then that turns to outright terror when he discovers a gaping murder chasm is the basement. And then, obviously he finds the corpse and the plot develops from there. Yeah. I don't know. I just thought it was a super effective little scene. It almost felt like a great little short film within the context of the movie, while still being very continuous with the plot. Yeah, I liked it. It's just all the movie's strengths in one place.
I definitely agree. There's a lot to say there, but it made me think of one thing that kind of begins this whole entire offshoot to the plot. For a while, you're just sitting there saying, what the heck is up with that priest? You just find this guy with this weird maze necklace down there, and I don't know, for maybe an hour, it is never mentioned again.
Yeah.
And then you come across that one guy, I forget his last name, so all I can call him is Bob. Bob is that child predator with the boxes of snakes, and he's drawing mazes all over, and there might be some kind of tie there, and slowly you're working your way around, and this entire offshoot ends up being an integral part of the plot, because it all comes full circle when Gyllenhaal is going to Holly Jones' house, and he sees an image of her standing next to her husband, who is wearing the corpse's necklace. And it all comes together. It's so cool. This film is maze-like.
Yeah.
It's a cool motif throughout the film. But it's true. you hit dead ends and you get rerouted. And there are just things that don't make sense at all. And it almost feels like a shortcoming. But then you pull out and you look at the bigger picture, and it is all like perfectly crafted. I really did enjoy the entirety of that. You could kind of call it a B plot. I think of that one scene where Bob is in custody and he's supposed to be giving the police a map, but he's just drawing more mazes. And Jake Gyllenhaal is at his wit's end, and he is fed up. And he just storms the place, and he gets attacked by Bob after being aggressive. He provokes him. It's his fault. Other officers rush in, and in the confusion, Bob gets a gun and kills himself. And it's like, you hit a brick wall. That was your only lead. At this point in the film, you're saying, we know it's not Alex. It's got to be this guy. This is the only other suspect, and it's not him. And you say, okay, I don't even know where we can go from here. It's a great Dark Night of the Soul, but it's just so fantastic where from that moment, after that, the plot still progresses, and eventually you see how it all fits. And it's very cathartic.
Yeah, absolutely. That's Loki's lowest point, I'd say. And it's just an extremely gripping scene by itself. The film constantly recontextualizes its characters. I'd say that's one of its greatest strengths. Although, as I also said, the final twist bothered me. It constantly keeps you guessing where on the moral spectrum these characters will end up, where they are, you know? And obviously, examples 1 and 2 are Alex and Bob. I went in, I knew enough about the film that I thought Paul Dano probably isn't the actual bad guy.
Right.
But I didn't know for certain. And as the movie went on, I started to think, hey, I think it actually is him. And because he's Paul Dano, it was satisfying to watch him get the snot beat out of him, at least a little bit. But he and Bob both, by the end of the movie, I was feeling sorry for them.
Right.
Because it's revealed that they were actually kidnapped children who were traumatized by this horrible ordeal, Keller is another example of a character who constantly weaves around in the moral spectrum. It's a morally ambiguous movie, and it knows it. And it's very interesting in that regard. And as I've said, the only thing that bothers me is that the twist villain doesn't really gel well with that moral ambiguity. Although that's also a character who slides around in the moral spectrum and you're constantly guessing where they're at.
Yeah.
So, that right there is the movie, again, remaining strong.
Right.
Even in its weakest points.
It's interesting, and it ends up being a very great strength of this film that those two characters, Alex and Bob, were abducted children. At the end of the film, I think kind of the best thing is how ambiguous this is. And I say that hesitantly because it's not really. You kind of do have to create your own headcanon for what happens, but it is kind of clear if you are thinking about the thematic trajectory, what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And what it all means. And it makes me think of that Nietzsche quote, time is a flat circle, meaning that just nothing new happens. We just go round and round. The same things happen just at different times,
Mm-hmm.
And it's like you see kind of 3 different generations of abused children. You see, obviously, the 2 kidnapped girls.
Yeah.
Then you see Alex and Bob, who were kidnapped children, now young adults. And then you see Keller and Loki, who both, Keller's father commits suicide, and Loki grew up through foster homes. It's very cool to see each generation kind of represented this eventual triumph. And it's like the girls' chance to break that cycle because they were impacted by the prior generations.
Yeah.
It's not the most important theme in the film, but personally, it's my favorite. It's so cool. It's so profound to see kind of like this glorification of humanity. This is definitely one of the themes. It's just, maybe not a theme, but a concept. It's just looking at humanity, looking at the way that people interact with grief. In the end, it's like the antithesis of No Country for Old Men. Instead of Sheriff Tom Bell giving in and saying, the world is a terrible place. It's these people saying, I'm going to fight for it. And they make their own beautiful future.
It's trauma being passed down and down until the cycle is broken by a hopeful new generation, in other words.
Yeah.
And, I think that's absolutely a fantastic point. And obviously the whole central conflict of the film is caused by a previous generation being unable to handle trauma well.
Yeah.
You know, Holly and her husband's kid dies, and they just can't handle it.
Mm-hmm.
Great points. All right. We've already talked about this bit, but I think I'm going to ask you the big question, if you're ready.
I'm ready.
What's your favorite scene?
I think...
And why? This is an essay question.
Okay. I think it's tough to say. I was thinking about my favorite aspect. My favorite aspect is just this twisting plot. But my favorite scene, I gave it a little bit of thought, and it might be the whole climax. Just because it's so strong in terms of character arcs. Once you get past some of this goofiness, like, it's almost like coincidental the way that this situation arises.
Yeah.
But once we're in this situation where Holly and Loki are in this sudden standoff, she turns around and fires, and Loki fires, and it's, he just knows in time that he dodges, but he still gets grazed by the bullet. He's bleeding into his eyes. He's losing blood. You just watch this girl get poison injected to her. What an awful thing to see. And you see him have to, drive through. We talked about the beautiful cinematography, but, these, out of very shallow focus, very fuzzy lights. It looks gorgeous, but it's such an intense scene. We've played The Last of Us, and the opening scene in The Last of Us, or rather, when it gets to the part where you have to watch Joel's daughter die,
Oh, man.
that is the most brutal scene of any video game, cinema, or literature I have ever witnessed. You saw, I was unable to relive that. I had to look at my phone when you were going through that. And number 2 would be this scene, but it was more impactful because of everything that comes before it. It's like, if this girl dies, not only does this girl die, just all this awfulness that happens throughout the film is for nothing.
Mm-hmm.
But because she lives, you have such strong, cathartic character arcs. Loki becomes a better person. Keller becomes a better person. All these characters, you see joy come back to this world. Alex is able to be reunited with his family. It's just so great. It means so much in the context of the film. While as an individual scene taken from the film, it is so visceral. That's enough about me. Aidan, what is your favorite?
Oh, man. There are really a lot of good ones to choose from in this film. One of the ones that unexpectedly stuck out to me, at least as one of the most impactful, was the scene where after they raid Bob's house and they recover all the clothing, and Keller and Terrence Howard and his wife, I feel bad I can't remember the character's name, they come in to ID the clothing. And the just acting in that scene, especially on Hugh Jackman's part, is just unbelievable. And the way his voice quakes as he says to Loki softly, you could have stopped this, is horrible. It's horrible, and it's enthralling, and just its sheer power in the moment. And you can see in Loki's face that he knows Keller's right. He probably could have stopped this sooner. He could have rescued them, or he believes he could have. And it's sort of as we've said, this movie doesn't follow quite as much of a traditional plot structure. But I'd say it maybe is the lowest point before the climax.
I agree.
Because, right after that, Loki just goes in and he breaks all the stuff on his desk, and he just finally loses it for the first time in the movie. These characters are at their absolute lowest point. They have nothing left to lose. And right then is when the movie starts to climb back into the hopefulness that you're describing.
Yeah.
So again, that's also just a convergence of a bunch of great character arcs in one scene. especially for Keller, who has been sort of staving off the inevitable by sort of this drive towards constant action. You know, he kidnaps Alex and he's like walking around because he feels the urge to do something. Mm-hmm. And just the dejected slump and the misery on his face as he walks away from that, knowing that he tried as hard as he could and he still failed, or at least that's what he believes, is heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It's just so powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. You know, it's interesting that both the scenes we mentioned are kind of great because of the context they're put in, while standing on their own two legs. Mm-hmm. But that's an absolute triumph of this film, that almost every single scene is made better by what comes before it and what comes after it.
Yeah.
But that scene you were talking about in particular made me think of something. There was this very great shot, this establishing shot, the very first one in the scene, where it made me think of a recurring shot in Parasite. This great master shot of the house, and there's this pillar in the house that kind of acts as a visual boundary separating the two families. It means different things in different scenes.
Yeah.
But it's that kind of concept used again, where the way that Loki's the office that Loki's in is positioned in the camera, the edge of it becomes kind of like this line that splits the screen in half. And inside you have Loki and the one couple, and on the outside, sitting alone in these chairs in like a waiting area, is very small, almost in the background, Keller. And, you know, it kind of is this visual representation of him. He has isolated himself because of his despicable acts. You know, in this film, Villeneuve kind of has this rhythm in his visual language where you get maybe not comfortable, but familiar with it. Mm-hmm. And then, like, just bam, out of nowhere, he gives you this jaw-dropping, dripping with meaning shot. That one is complemented by another. After Bob kills himself, you see that exact same shot, except it is Loki sitting in the place where Keller once was. It means nothing alone. But because we saw that shot earlier, to us it means that Loki is detaching himself, and means that he is putting guilt on himself.
Yeah.
That's so cool. I can think of one more.
Go for it.
It's just a very small, simple thing that you see sometimes, but was just done so well in this film. The first time that Keller goes to meet Holly, he knocks on her door, and it's like this conversation done in these like reverse shot. The camera's in between the two. And then all of a sudden, before they go in the house, it just cuts to this wide-angle shot of them staring at each other on opposite sides of the screen, like this showdown.
Yeah.
Like they're ready to almost, go to battle, but they just can't. And there's this tension created by just a masterfully conducted, it's a very simple shot, but it just, the implications in that context are profound. And those are reasons that I love Denis Villeneuve, who prioritizes the technique of a film, the technical aspects. That's why I like him over some other directors like Fincher and Michael Mann, who place the same emphasis on the technical.
It's just maximum impact. Yeah. What do you think? And I hate to do this because, we've already discussed it some. And honestly, I think I've fallen in love with this film more and more as we've discussed it over the podcast, and you've convinced me more. What do you think is your least favorite aspect of this very good movie?
They come up in some nitpicks, and maybe we can have conversations about all these. But there are a couple cop-outs in this film, I feel like. One of which I can think of is the scene in which Detective Loki is done being suspicious and goes to investigate, and he finally goes to that apartment complex in which Keller is holding Alex.
Yeah.
And it's this super suspenseful scene, and you're just waiting for something to happen. Like, it's gonna mean something. Like, either Loki straight up finds Alex and this blows up, or Keller has to outsmart him, and it's gonna be something. It's gonna be something meaningful for the characters. Or it's gonna be set up for something else. Or just give me anything, and it just ends. Loki just gets called away, and nothing comes of it. It was like Guzikowski knew that the scene had to be in the film, but didn't want to do anything with it. Mm-hmm. So he just put it in and didn't do anything with it.
Yeah, that's a good point. I thought it was a bit of a cop-out. It's still tense, very much so, especially like the way he just kind of briefly peeks into the bathroom before coming out and talking to Keller some more while standing close to the bathroom. It was well done, and I like watching these characters interact, but it did feel a bit unnecessary.
Yeah. What do you have on your list?
I've talked about it already. I don't like the twist villain. Just too gimmicky, too out there.
What do you think about it being a twist, though? Would you say it's strong, or would you say it's not strong? Well developed or not?
I mean, it's definitely a good gotcha moment. I will say the movie got me. I did not see it coming. So in that sense, yes, it's a good twist. It's a powerful twist. I just don't think it's all that well developed. And the central mystery of the film has, and it's very hard to write a good mystery without having at least a few too convenient conveniences.
Yeah, it's true.
Or a few overdramatic gotcha moments. But this film does have a few of them. It's like, man, I'm struggling to notice remember the details. But like in that scene where Loki freaks out and he sweeps all the stuff off his desk, there's like something he notices.
Yeah.
That was a little too convenient.
Right.
But that and the villain aside, I think this is one of the best movies I've seen in a while, and I really enjoyed it. And now that I've seen, I think, all of Villeneuve's major American films, I would like to go back and look at his earlier catalog.
Yeah, that's where I am too. I would like to point out 2 hit picks real quick.
Hit picks?
Yeah. One of them, I don't really have anywhere else to put this, but on rewatch, it was like a gut punch. At the very beginning of the film, maybe like 5 minutes after the girls are abducted, Detective Loki does actually go to Holly Jones' house as he has Alex in custody, and he's questioning her. And that shot opens with him looking through the window of that rusted car.
Really?
That is used to cover up the hole to where the girls are being hidden. And I saw that and I was like, oh my gosh. The second hit pick almost became my favorite scene, but definitely has to be my favorite line. You could take this out of context, but Alex Jones is the full name of our number one suspect. So Detective Loki says at one point, Alex Jones, unfortunately, has the IQ of a 10-year-old. Detective Loki, I absolutely agree.
That's hysterical. I was wondering the entire time, like, there's no way it's just a coincidence, right? He's got to be aware of it. Especially because Alex Jones is a fake name, which is given to him by 2 old people who I would not be surprised at all if they watch InfoWars. There's no way.
Villeneuve is trying to uncover this conspiracy in which Alex Jones in real life kidnaps underage girls.
Who knows? Maybe Alex Jones was like projecting about Pizzagate this entire time. All right. Ethan, it was a pleasure watching this movie. It was a pleasure discussing it with you.
As always.
And I think we're about running out of good things to say, or at least I am. And I don't want to waste folks at home's time any further. So, thank you, everybody, so much for listening to this episode. Thank you for listening to the end with us. Please join us next week. We'll be discussing the Coen brothers' Inside Llewyn Davis, which is a film I really love. Ethan hasn't seen it before, so now we get to each recommend each other one Coen's film. Tune in for that. Should be a lot of fun. You can contact us in a few different ways. We've got Twitter, @CriticsArmchair is our handle. We've got an Instagram, Armchair Critics Podcast. And we've got an email, armchaircriticspodcast@gmail.com. Please feel free to send us movie recommendations, questions, feedback, anything you feel like. Contact us. Thank you again for listening, and have a great night.